Thank you everyone for coming today. We're really excited to learn about this research and to have you all here to participate. My name is Sara Swett. I'm with Oregon Sea Grant. I am a marine renewable energy extension specialist. So I've been focusing a lot on offshore wind energy and wave energy in Oregon. And I'll tell you a little bit about Oregon Sea Grant if you're not familiar with who we are and what we do. We are a cooperative agreement between NOAA and Oregon State University, and our purpose is to really serve the Oregon coast on topics and issues that are relevant. So marine renewable energy has been a big topic of interest in the past couple years in Oregon. So we're really interested in learning about what type of research is kind of addressing that topic right now. We have 4 focus areas. We do environmental literacy and workforce development, sustainable fisheries and aquaculture, healthy coastal ecosystems, and resilient communities and economies. And to address all those focus areas, we work through extension, which is like engagement, education, and research. So today we're going to just do a quick little introduction. I'll go over some of the webinar tech. As you guys can see, we're just using a regular Zoom meeting format, so none of the fancy webinar stuff today. We'll get started with our presentation soon, and then the presentation will last about 40 minutes, and we'll move into a question and answer and discussion. Then we'll wrap up and let you guys all go on to the rest of your days. 2 things. We're going to do a little pre-webinar poll and a post-webinar poll. That helps us kind of understand how these programs are helping you all learn about these topics, and really appreciate if you guys participate in the polls. It's very helpful for us to see that feedback. So today our learning goal is to understand a bit more about how researchers in Oregon are collecting and analyzing data to improve understanding of marine mammal and seabird distribution and inform ocean planning for things such as offshore wind. So one of the main projects that we'll be covering today is the MOSAIC project. That was in the title and the invite for this webinar, but Leigh and Dawn will also talk about some of the other projects that they work on too. So when the MOSAIC project was first funded, the federal government was still exploring offshore wind energy in federal waters off of Oregon. But recently, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, has withdrawn the 2 designated wind areas that were off of Oregon. So California is still exploring offshore wind. They have 5 active lease areas. So the research from the MOSAIC project is still definitely very relevant to the region. Oregon, while we do not now have any active offshore wind areas, the Department of Land Conservation and Development, which is a state agency, has been leading a process to develop an offshore wind energy roadmap in case someday offshore wind comes back to Oregon, that the state can be prepared and resourced to approach it in the best way possible. So definitely a lot has changed in the context of offshore wind in Oregon, but we're going to learn about this research and we're going to learn how the data, even if we don't have offshore wind, can be incorporated with the other projects and applied for other ocean uses too. We have a little meeting contract just to make sure everything goes smoothly. We want to honor the agenda and the learning goal. Please be respectful of different opinions and perspectives on the topic and the research. Ask questions and participate. If you'd like to, introduce yourself while you speak, and then just be mindful of your speaking time because we've got a lot of participants today and only so much time. And for webinar tech, we do have closed captions available. You should be able to see it in your options on Zoom. It would either show up like that or be under the More button, and then you can set the language for your captions. During the presentation, we'll take clarifying questions, but we'll save all of our bigger discussion questions for the latter half of the presentation. And so you can put those questions in the chat while the presentation is happening. We'll keep track of them and then save any of the more juicy questions for the discussion. And then if you want to ask an anonymous question, we do have the Q&A feature. And if you want to come off mute or put your video on, you can raise your hand and ask a question that way. Otherwise, I will, read the questions from the chat and the Q&A. And we are recording this webinar, as you guys may see. We'll record all the way through the question and answer and discussion. So again, just note that you are being recorded. So if you're comfortable coming off mute or off video, that is totally up to you. And we also have Jamie Doyle here, who's also Oregon Sea Grant. She's helping monitor the chat and Q&A. So if you have any extra tech support questions, just put them in the chat and we'll do our best to keep track of that. So I'm going to give a quick pre-webinar poll. Just answer these little questions to the best of your ability.
Sarah, there's a quick question in the chat about where the recording will be made available.
Yeah, that's a great question. We will send the recording to all of our registrants when this is done, usually in the following week or so. And then we also post it to our YouTube channel. So I'll make sure that that recording gets sent out to all of you guys. And also any additional resources or questions that come up that we can't answer now, I'll put together some resources that you guys can all access after the webinar. All right, so while you guys do this survey, I would love to introduce Leigh and Dawn here, and I'll let them get up their slides. So, and that. Okay. So Dr. Leigh Torres is a marine ecologist with Oregon State University's Marine Mammal Institute. And Dr. Dawn Barlow is also a marine ecologist and a postdoctoral scholar at the Marine Mammal Institute. So they are going to go over some of their amazing work that they do in the GEM lab, which they will talk a little bit about their lab and their work, and I'll let them give a better introduction to the work that they're doing today. So let's see. Wow, thank you guys for all of the responses to the poll too. That is very helpful. All right, Leigh and Dawn, I will let you guys take it away. Thank you again for being here and presenting to us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. We're pretty excited to be here and share some of the work that we've been doing. So here we go. Okay, so we're going to start with, we'd like to start with acknowledging and thanking all of our many collaborators, partners, and funders that have been behind all the work that we're going to share with you today. It's really been, as you'll see, an extensive effort to collect a lot of data and analyze that data, and that takes many, many partners and collaborators and funders. So people on this slide are very important and integral to what we'll be showing you today. So thank you. Okay. All right, so as most of us probably know, the oceans cover more than 70% of our planet, and previously humanity thought that this large expanse was inexhaustible, pretty much, or very, no matter what we did to it, we'd have limited impacts on it. But what we've seen is that as human populations have grown and grown, we have an expanding footprint on our oceans, particularly in coastal zones. And human use of oceans is diversifying and expanding in intensity and in range. So what we see here, are a few examples of that: wind energy, fisheries, vessel traffic, recreational use, and pollution. And these are just what's happening today. And as as humanity keeps changing and developing new technology and new resource needs, likely the impacts on the ocean that we're going to have are going to change throughout time. So, like recently in the last, 5 or so years, marine renewable energy, well, 10 years, has really come on the scene as an important one, whereas 20 years ago we weren't really thinking about that. So it's important to always anticipate what's coming next and not limit ourselves to just thinking about one impact, because these threats not only impact the oceans and marine wildlife, but also each other. So they often have conflicts in space use with each other. So, but all of these acute threats that humans are putting pressure on the oceans is also happening within the backdrop of climate change. And that just creates, often exacerbates impacts that these other human activities have, and also impacts our ability to predict how marine wildlife or ecosystems will respond to these human activities. So all of this has unintended and extensive impacts on marine wildlife and ecosystems. So for the purpose of our talk today, we're focusing in on marine mammal response and seabirds to these impacts. And what you see in these sad slides, sad pictures, are some very acute impacts of human activities in the ocean. But there's also all the less acute, so non-direct impacts on wildlife, such as noise pollution or animals being disturbed so that they leave important habitat where they would normally be feeding, and then that might cause them to have less ability to gain the energy they need if they don't have access to their normal habitat and resources. So spatial management has emerged over the last, well, a long time, I guess, as it can be a very effective tool to try to separate in space and time a human activity from impacts on marine wildlife. But key to having effective spatial management is knowing where and when those animals are in the marine environment. And that can be a tricky thing to know. But once we have that information, often what we can apply are either static approaches to spatial management, which is where we basically put a line around the ocean in certain boxes, and we say, okay, a human activity can't happen in this area. And these static approaches to spatial management can be easier to apply because once you put the boundary on, that restriction's in place. And the alternative approach, which can be trickier to apply, is dynamic spatial management, which means basically based on some information about where the conflict is between the animals and the human activity, you can turn that spatial boundary of restricted activity on and off. And while this sounds good, the idea behind it is great because it can be less burdensome to the human activity, to restrictions on the human activity. It can be harder to implement because you obviously need to communicate that information better to the human users of the ocean. And you also have to be pretty good about knowing where the animals are in space and time that you're trying to protect. So a key element to spatial management, to effective spatial management of marine megafauna, is to recognize the data gaps that you have in understanding where animals are and try to fill them early with data collection and through consistent methods. So in my lab here in the Marine Mammal Institute with Oregon Sea Grant, we have been using consistent data collection methods, something called distance sampling, which we'll describe in a second, in Oregon since 2016. So this predates sort of interest in marine offshore renewable energy. But pretty much I recognized early on in my time here at Oregon State University that we didn't really have a great understanding of the distribution of marine mammals and seabirds in our offshore shelf waters. So distance sampling is basically when we're on a track line, going across the ocean. When we see a a marine mammal, we immediately mark the location that we saw the animal from, and then its distance and angle from the track line, as we try to describe in this little schematic on the left. And by accounting for that distance and angle of the observation, as well as the environmental conditions that we saw the animal in, so whether it was a big swell or low swell or foggy or not foggy, things like that, that affect our detectability of the animals. Through these consistent data collection methods, so it's called distance sampling, whether we're on a boat surveying, so as the middle picture shows, or on a helicopter, as the right image shows, we're using these same data collection methods, and that allows us to integrate all that data regardless of the platform. So we have 3 distinct yet complementary projects that have been using this distance sampling method for about 10 years now, and it's compiled a lot of data. And so we're going to describe those 3 projects to you and then explain what we can do with all that powerful data. So one of the projects is called OPAL, and it stands for the Overlap Predictions About Large Whales. And this has to do with fisheries entanglement between whales and different fisheries on the Oregon coast. Another project is called HALO, which stands for the Holistic Assessment of Living Marine Resources off Oregon. And here we're collecting data on marine mammals and seabirds to look at how they respond to environmental change in our oceans over time. And then we have the MOSAIC project, which MOSAIC stands for Marine Offshore Species Assessment to Inform Clean Energy. And this has to do with trying to inform siting of offshore wind projects in our coastal waters. So I'll give a little bit of a description about each project and the distinctiveness of them. So starting with OPAL. So the goal here is to inform management decisions to reduce entanglements in fishing gear of whales and fishing gear, primarily the Dungeness crab fishery, which is very important in Oregon waters, but additionally other fisheries as well. So the funding for this project has come from NOAA, from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and from the Oregon Dungeness Crab Commission. Our partners through this project have been the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Dungeness crab fishery, U.S. Coast Guard, and many OSU and NOAA scientists. So what's unique about this project and our data collection for it is that we have this amazing partnership with the U.S. Coast Guard, where we fly in their helicopters 4 times a month along each one of these track lines depicted in the diagram on the right. So we try to do each one of these survey routes once a month throughout the whole year. So that is really unique to be, especially to be able to get like data throughout the winter season. But in addition to that partnership with the U.S. Coast Guard, we also put observers on ships of opportunity, such as our partnership with NOAA on their Northern California Current ecosystem cruises, as well as on STEM cruises run by Oregon Sea Grant on the Pacific Storm and other OSU research cruises as well. Oops. So this little video is just a fun video that shows you what it's like to be in a helicopter and seeing a whale. So this is our great observer Craig Hayslip taking a photograph of a fin whale that he's spotted down there that's being escorted along by, I think, some Dall's porpoise there. So it's pretty spectacular way to view animals in our ocean. Okay, so the HALO project. Here, our goal is to monitor seabird and marine mammals' response to environmental change. Our funding for this project initially came from the MMI Gray Whale License Plate Fund. So if you have a gray whale license plate on your car, thank you very much for helping to support this project and others. And most recently, we have received funding from NASA to keep this project going for a few more years, which is excellent. So our partners on this program are many scientists across MMI, the Marine Mammal Institute, Oregon State University, different departments and groups, as well as scientists from Cornell University. So here what we're doing is we are surveying quarterly along this track line here called the NH line, which this blue star here is Newport. And so the NH line is the Newport hydrographic line, which has been established for 60 years of monitoring oceanography and zooplankton along that line. So we basically just are piggybacking along that line and doing these surveys in a vessel, as you can see on the right photo there, just using those distance sampling methods. But we also have deployed hydrophones at these purple triangle locations, which record the vocalizations of multiple different marine mammal species. And that is another way that we can monitor animals' occurrence in the ocean to try to predict their distribution patterns. And then finally, we have the MOSAIC project, which here the goal is to inform the siting of offshore wind energy development in Oregon and Northern California waters. So the funding for this project has come from the Department of Energy. And again, multiple partners, including an MMI, the Seabird Oceanography Lab here at OSU, and Cascadia Research Collective, which is a nonprofit based up in Olympia, Washington. So here are data. Again, we're doing vessel surveys on the Pacific Storm, if you're familiar with that research vessel. But our track line here is this green line depicted here that zigzags on and off the coast over the shelf waters from the Columbia River down to Cape Mendocino. And so we did this survey 3 times a year in spring, summer, and fall. And then in addition to that, we had 2 hydrophones deployed within this study system over a 2-year period to record, again, vocalizations of marine mammals. So with all of that effort over many years, these are our on-effort survey track lines for either marine mammals on the left figure there or seabirds on the right. And combined, it is a lot of survey effort, particularly in the shelf regions of Oregon. And just as an example, so between 2016 and 2024, these track lines and the colored little circles show where we saw whales. So this is only the baleen whales, but we conducted 395 days of survey with over 69,000 kilometers of the ocean surveyed and seeing over 3,600 whales. So it's a lot of data, but using those consistent distance sampling methods, we're able to integrate data collected over multiple survey platforms. So whether the helicopter surveys or more ship-based surveys as seen on the right. So
Leigh,
what I hope you're taking away is that,
there's one clarifying question in here that was back to the helicopters. Do they bother the whales?
No, we don't fly that low. So we're flying at about 500 feet above and above the ocean, and basically just keep staying on track line. We don't even break survey when we see a whale. We just mark the species. So we don't hover or circle around animals, or at least not very often, unless we see some animal in distress or something. So no, and if we did, it's probably, if they even could hear the helicopter, it would be very brief. Hopefully that answered that question. Okay, so hopefully what you're understanding here is that through these various different projects, we've collected this really powerful, unique, and extensive data set through consistent methods, year-round data, which is really, exciting and unique, and also at high resolution. So pretty precise locations in the ocean where we're seeing animals, and that allows us to connect those locations with environmental conditions there as well as impacts. So it's an excellent baseline data to support analysis and management needs for multiple management questions. And so I just wanted to show some examples from the OPAL project of what we've done with this data to better understand the distribution of baleen whales in Oregon waters. So one thing we did was looked at the temporal patterns of these animals in the water, in the waters of Oregon. And one of the first patterns we saw is that over time, so compared to 1989 to recent periods, we've had an increase in whale occurrence in Oregon waters, which is interesting. So the number of humpback whales, the orange, has shot up, but also fin and blue whales have really increased over time. We can also look at the seasonality of these different species in Oregon waters. So what we see here is that humpback whales, the orange line here, They tend to arrive in Oregon waters earlier, and then blue whales later in the year, between August and November, we have more blue whales. And then fin whales seem to occur more in fall and winter. So again, all that information is helping us, or can help us understand how to avoid conflicts with different activities in the ocean. Obviously, we can also build species distribution models, which Don will talk about in a moment, but we can make these predictions about where animals will be over time. So this is just a snapshot of September, predictions for rorquals. So rorquals are humpbacks, blue whales, and fin whales in Oregon waters over 6 different years. And you can see that the bright spots, the sort of red areas, change between years, and that's based on environmental conditions. So with those spatial predictions, what we can then do is overlay them with a human activity. So in this case, what we're showing here is a monthly, the left panel is a monthly prediction of whale density. And then this middle panel is where Dungeness crab fishing effort occurred, and this was provided by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. And basically all we did was multiply these 2 rasters, so the values in each cell, to come up with a measure of exposure to fishing risk of the whales. And so with this data, we can do this over a 10-year period, basically, and at a pretty high temporal resolution month by month to see how that exposure to risk varies in space and time. And then with that information about variable exposure, we can look at, how those exposure changes. And one thing we found is that for humpback or rorqual exposure to fishing effort, it actually peaks in April. And that's because the fishing industry is still active at that point in time. The Dungeness crab fishing fleet is still going strong, and we're starting to get more and more whales in our habitat here off Oregon. Also, interestingly, we can look at annual cycles in exposure to this risk. And what we found was that during the 2014, 15, and 16 period, when we had the marine heat wave here in Oregon waters, the exposure of baleen whales to fishing effort from the Dungeness crab fleet actually declined. And we think that's because the conditions in Oregon waters for baleen whales weren't very good. There just wasn't a lot of prey around, so there weren't a lot of whales around in our area. And then we can also try to look at, the relationships of these exposure to different risks relative to larger scale environmental patterns. So the top panel here is relating either whale occurrence or the fishing fleet or the exposure to the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And what's interesting here is that we basically see that the fishing effort stays the same no matter what the level of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation is. But in contrast, we see that whale occurrence does change relative to whether it's a negative PDO or a positive PDO. And that's really what determines their exposure to the fishing effort. And we see similar things when we relate that exposure to the amount of upwelling, which is this QD index here, that whales respond highly to that level of upwelling, and then so does their exposure to fishing effort. So really what it all comes down to is that through these methods of data collection, analysis that I've just given you some examples from, we can inform actual management applications to try to reduce conflict. And so ODFW has taken our data and revised fishing regulations so that after May 1st, there is a 40 fathom limit to where fishing effort can occur. We are in discussions with ODFW about having more dynamic strategies based on some of our more recent results that are coming through just now, still underway. And NOAA is convening a take reduction team to try to reduce continued whale bycatch in fishing effort. And these results will be directly informing that process and those discussions. So I think that's it. Yes, for me. So hopefully that gives you an example of how we collect our data and then what the applications of it are. So Don's going to get into more of the specifics now, particularly regarding the MOSAIC project.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, thanks. Thanks again for the opportunity to chat with all of you and to share sort of the work that we're doing and to put this work out there to an engaged group of colleagues and managers and stakeholders. And so yeah, Leigh really lined up the the various projects that we're involved in, or a few of the various projects we're involved in, and the value of consistent data collection so that all of these different data collection efforts can feed into, for different projects, can feed into each other to inform management applications. And so I'm going to talk about sort of the middle slice in between there. Leigh talked about the data collection and the applications, and I'm going to go through a little bit of what that middle section is of taking the data from spending a lot of time, like in a place like this. This is a beautiful rainbow day. You spend a lot of time looking for whales and not seeing whales and standardizing your data collection. And then how do you go from that to the maps that can inform management? And so all of this rests on a really key set of tools that we use heavily in our work, which is species distribution modeling. And so this is a toolbox that basically lets you go from, you have observations of where an animal occurred along, say, a vessel track line. So in this little cartoon schematic, you have a track line of a boat going through the water, and you count the location of some animal as you go. And so what we're interested in is then overlaying that, the survey effort and the sighting locations with environmental covariates. So where you saw animals and where you didn't see animals. What was the temperature? What was the salinity? What was the primary productivity? What was the wind forcing? And so you sort of sample, it's like you take sort of like a multi-layer cake at each location and sample each environmental covariate. And that's what you feed into these models. And so these are multivariate models that lets you get at what we call functional relationships. And what this does, this is sort of a simplified cartoon way of looking at it, but it allows you to say, okay, considering where this animal is and all of the things happening in the environment that we can measure, what is the relationship between, say, predictor one is temperature, what is the relationship between the impact of temperature on the density of this animal? And by doing this in this sort of multivariate space, you can get these functional relationships between where you're likely to see an animal or what the environmental conditions you're likely to see an animal in. And that allows you to make these predictions in space and time of species distributions, to make these sort of smoothed maps of not just where you were, but also the areas where you weren't, whether that's to a different time or a place that you just sort of missed with the boat, etc. And so that's where we get these maps from. Now, a bit more of a nuance is that a special flavor of species distribution models that we rely on is density surface modeling. And Leigh touched on this before, where so if you have some observers, they're going along this track line. This is a picture from the crow's nest of the Pacific storm. We have a port and a starboard observer, and they're looking for animals. When they see it, make an observation, they measure the distance through that distance sampling. But you can imagine that if you're looking for a little animal like these harbor porpoises, you're really looking for something more like this, and that's on a really good day. And so under different conditions, the distance over which you can detect an animal is going to vary. And so all of that, so if it's really windy, you're going to be able to make detections over shorter distances. So we bring that in through this detection function to account for detection probability, and bring that in along with our to sort of adjust or offset what we then can learn about the relationships between these animals and their environment in those species distribution models I just talked about. So to look at sort of an example of those steps I just described in schematic form with a real animal that we see out there. So Pacific white-sided dolphins are a species that we commonly observe out on the water on all of these surveys. And these are maps of our observation locations of where we saw Pacific white-sided dolphins in each season over all of the survey effort that Leigh described. Those dots are scaled by the number of animals seen at that location, and we can see just from looking at where we saw them that they're oftentimes observed in these large groups. That sort of largest dot is 400 animals at that location. We see them year round, and they're most often seen most of our sightings happen in the spring and summer. So then we can build these distribution models and get at these functional relationships. And without worrying about what the alphabet soup of acronyms are, Each of those is a different environmental variable and its influence on the density of these Pacific white-sided dolphins. So this can tell us things, this can help us sort of interpret where the animals are or what's driving their distribution patterns. So from this we can learn things like Pacific white-sided dolphins have higher densities in areas near the shelf edge with warmer temperatures and less stratified water column. And taking those functional relationships, we can then make these predictions and aggregate them across sort of the period we're interested in to get these aggregated seasonal distribution patterns. So that's what I'm showing here for Pacific white-sided dolphins, which shows sort of higher densities in spring and summer and near the shelf edge. And when you have these maps, that's when you can think about overlaying these distribution patterns with the different potential impacts or threats that you're interested in, like what Leigh described. And here as an example, are in those white bounding lines are the wind energy areas in Oregon, and then the southern one is off of Humboldt as an example. So this that example was from the MOSAIC project, and in the MOSAIC project, we're doing these sorts of analyses for 22 different seabird species and 11 different cetacean species, leveraging all of these data to make distribution maps for all of these different species to get at what are the seasonal and spatial distribution patterns of these species. So I'm going to give you some teaser results. I'll emphasize here that this work is ongoing, but we're excited to share with you where we're at now. So I will just pin that caveat in there that this work is ongoing. But let's look to some of the seabird results. And I'll also, one more little caveat is that at least where focus is primarily on the cetacean side of things, and we're fortunate to work with some really excellent seabird biologists on this work who are really helpful in interpreting the sort of species biology side of things. So these are those predicted distributions for 3 different example seabird species: black-footed albatrosses, pink-footed shearwaters, and common murres. And these are sort of interesting case examples because there are some commonly seen species on our surveys. They have very different sort of life history and biology. The black-footed albatrosses are these wide-ranging scavengers. They breed in the central North Pacific. Pink-footed and you can see they're sort of more distributed, a bit more offshore. Pink-footed shearwaters are here primarily in the summer. You can see there's this big hot spot looking area that's actually over Hecata Bank, and then they fly all the way to the South Pacific to breed and then come back here to feed in the summer. And common murres, many of you probably see from shore because they have these important breeding colonies right along our coastline. And so this different species life history means that they respond differently to the environmental conditions, and that combination of environmental conditions and species life history shapes these different spatial and seasonal distribution patterns. And so while it's really interesting to sort of think about the story of each of these animals individually, I mean, as biologists, we are fascinated by this and can nerd out for a long time about any one of these particular maps. But when we think about how to bring this all together or integrate it for some application, it can be really helpful to think about hotspots, or to try and think about where are there hotspots in all of these species distributions. So if we can think about layering all of these different distribution maps for a whole lot of different species, for example, our 22 focal seabirds, we can think about using these sort of layers to look at, okay, where are there hotspots in biodiversity, or where are there hotspots of animals? But that begs a really important question, which is, what is a hotspot? What makes an area important? Is it an area that has the greatest number of animals? Do we want to think about measuring where are the most birds? Do we want to think about where are areas where there's the greatest species greatest species diversity? So where are you going to get the sort of most even spread of different species? Or are we really concerned about highlighting areas that are of particular importance for species that have some sort of conservation need, that have endangered status or are in decline? And we can flip this too in thinking about sort of a more marine spatial planning context of, are there, not just are there hot spots, but where are there what we can think of as cold spots? Are there areas where that are not used by a lot of animals at a given time, that where impacts would be minimal? So here are some more really colorful maps that I'll step you through. And this is ways of visualizing those three different questions that I just laid out. The leftmost panel is total seabird density. So this is areas where are the most birds. And in this case, the warmer colors are areas with the highest number of birds per square kilometer. The middle set of panels is the species diversity. And so that's the evenness of different species occurring. And in this case, the warmer, brighter yellow colors are areas with higher species diversity. The right set of panels is areas of the warmer colors are higher importance to species that have either international, so IUCN, or federal or state status as endangered, threatened, or vulnerable. And there's a subset of the species that are in our data set that fall into these categories of some level of conservation concern. And so while this is like a lot of bright colors, one thing that can jump out without even looking at it for that long is that they all look kind of different. They look different between seasons, and they look different between the different measurements. And so we can take this and distill it down into these sort of hot spots and cold spots using spatial statistics. I'm not going to go into the actual statistics, but I'm going to show you the hot spots and cold spots that fall out of those patterns. So these polygons, these boundary boxes, show areas that have significant clusters of either high values in the red, those are our hot spots, or low values in the blue, those are our cold spots. And so, and this is done by each metric and for each season. And so looking at these, sort of defining these hot and cold spots, then allows you to overlay these with different potential human impacts of interest. In this particular example, those gray boxes are the wind energy areas in Oregon and Northern California. And you can see that what's interesting here is that each of these metrics, the most birds, the greatest diversity, species of conservation concern, shows a bit of a different pattern in overlap. So you can see that, for example, this wind area that, we don't know what the future of this is now, it's on hold for now, but just as an example, right, this wind area off of Brookings is in a cold spot, so minimal impact for the total number of birds, but it is in a hot spot for species diversity, at least in some seasons. Or this area off of the Humboldt lease area is in a cold spot, again, for total number of species, but it's right in this hot spot for species of conservation concern in the fall. So all of this to say that these different ways to think about where are important areas will highlight different potential impacts depending on how you measure it. And so to circle back to this question of, well, what constitutes a hotspot? It really depends on how you define it. And that has kind of substantially different implications for how this can be applied. And so to sort of step back a little bit here, I mean, we as the scientists put a lot of effort into collecting the data, and then our work begins with analyzing the data, and we can quantify and carefully measure and account for various levels of uncertainty and make these really sort of informed maps based on our analysis. And they show different things, and how that will be applied sort of is then is in the hands of the managers, but also sort of it depends on the feedback that is given by folks like the folks on this call, the stakeholders, of what are the priorities, and how will we take the data that we collect and analyze, and how will that be then translated into the applications.
Hey, Dawn, a question came in. I'm wondering if you could go to the last slide talking about the map on the right. Do you know which species of concern would have caused the hotspot yeah, I'm
Hmm.
assuming in the Humble area.
Yeah, I will need to go back and look at the data for that of which species are driving that. There's a subset of 9 species from our list that do have that threat listing. And I could follow up actually maybe during the Q&A with like I can put in the chat box what that list that has those the status and which species specifically are driving that hotspot. I think will require some further analysis because this is an aggregation of the relative importance across all of those 9 species. So during the Q&A, I'm happy to pass along what those 9 species are, though.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay, so we're going to pivot from seabirds to talking about the biggest marine mammal out there, biggest animal actually, and give an example of, so I've just talked about bringing together data for multiple species. I'm going to take a little bit of a different angle and talk about one species, but bringing together different data types and drawing on the strengths of multiple, data sources. We've spent a lot of time focused on the visual survey component today, but in the MOSAIC project, which is a large collaboration among folks in the Marine Mammal Institute that have been collecting a lot of different types of marine mammal data, cetacean data for many years, we're able to also leverage these other data types such as acoustic monitoring and tracking, so putting tags on large whales and tracking their movements for a few of these species, blue whales being one of them. So not only do we have the density maps from the visual surveys that we've just showed, we also can get movement and occupancy information from tracked individuals. Here is a little tag on the back of that blue whale. And Leigh mentioned the deployment of hydrophones, which listen for all sorts of vocalizations, including blue whales, which sound like this. So now that we've talked about methods already, so I'm going to cut straight to the chase and show you the maps on this one. But what this is showing is the distribution maps from models that are made based on each of these different data sets. Visual surveys on the left, acoustic monitoring from these different hydrophone locations shown in the stars, and from the tracking. And here I do want to give a shout out to our colleagues that have made this various data collection and analysis possible. So Kate Stafford and Emma Pearson on the acoustics side and Lad Irvine on the tracking side. And each of these different data types has its strengths and also its weaknesses. And so by comparing and combining these, we can sort of draw from the strengths of each and account for the weaknesses of each as well. So that's a real strength when we have these multiple data types. And you can see some sort of different seasonal patterns that emerge from the different data types. That can be explained by some things like, well, the songs produced by blue whales are produced by the males and they may vocalize more in the fall, for example, or when tags were put on animals. But one thing that I find really cool to see in these maps is that certain areas pop up as being key important habitat areas across the board, namely these areas around Cape Blanco and Cape Mendocino. So as I mentioned, this work is ongoing. And so our next steps are to bring these different data types together into some ensemble models and ensemble outputs to, like I just said, sort of leverage the strengths of each while minimizing or offsetting the uncertainty of each. And then we're also going to think similarly about these hotspots or sort of areas of greatest numbers of animals and diversity of animals for the cetacean side of things as well. So stay tuned because the work is ongoing. It's always ongoing. And so with that, I'll just sort of speak for both of us to say thanks for the opportunity to be here and to chat with all of you and to share some of our work that has supported multiple different projects over the years. And thanks to Sea Grant for organizing and for hosting. And happy to continue into question and discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, guys. That was a wonderful, thorough presentation. I really enjoyed looking at all of those maps and pictures. There were a couple questions. Well, let's see, before I jump into the questions, just want to say that now we're in our discussion portion, so you guys can use the Q&A feature, the chat, or you can raise your hand if you would like to come off mute and put your video on and ask a question. Again, we are recording, so if that's something you're comfortable with, just letting you know. Otherwise, I will gladly read all of the questions. We had a lot come in, so I will try to address all of these ones that came in during the presentation first. There were a couple questions about the species that you guys selected, how you selected the species. Someone asked that the marbled murrelet was not on the list of survey birds, so there are some questions about how you selected them, and also questions about sea lions too. I noticed that they're not included in the research, so if you guys could just speak to a little bit about how you pick those species, that would be great.
Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, it's the species are selected not based on favorites, but based on data availability and survey design. So our track lines, if you remember from those maps, they prioritize sort of shelf waters, and they go all the way to the slope edge in many cases, and then dip into the nearshore areas. So we did see marbled murrelets during these surveys, but generally just during those very nearshore sort of corners of the surveys, which meant that there were not enough observations in our data set to make robust models. So when we're out there, we don't pick what species we are and aren't going to count. We count everything. We count every cetacean and every bird, whether it's a seabird or whether it's a songbird that that came with us on the boat or anything, right? So it's or any species
and pinnipeds.
And pinnipeds, we do count all of them as well. So the priority for the MOSAIC project was the cetaceans and the seabirds, and which species ended up in that list of 22 has to do with which ones had enough observations over our data collection period for the models to perform well enough that we could trust the maps.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, thanks. And someone asked, are there studies that associate marine mammals with other species? Or did you guys look at any relationships between different species in the study?
Like communities of individuals?
I think so.
No, we haven't done that, but that is something we've discussed doing. It's sort of outside the immediate scope of what we've been funded to do for the MOSAIC project and these other projects, actually. But it is a very interesting question to see what species co-occur, and actually through these sort of diversity hotspot analyses and things like that, we do plan to adjust that in the future. So yeah, exciting question.
Cool. There were also quite a few questions about commercial fishing and kind of the overlap there. Someone was wondering if and how commercial fishermen are included in any of this research, or if there's any sort of overlap with commercial fishing activities and the research that you do.
Yeah, great question. Yes, the OPAL project, really a huge partnership is with the fishing community, and the Oregon Dungeness Crab Commission have funded the work. So in the inception of the OPAL project, basically it was through discussions with fishermen and managers and environmental NGOs, where everybody recognized that if we're going to have any management regulations put in place, we need better information on where the whales are in the ocean. Everybody recognized that was a huge data gap. And so the fishermen were, you know, I can't say every fisherman because I certainly didn't talk to every fisherman, and there's a diverse range of, you know, opinions there, but there were many that had supported the project that I can, you know, continue to discuss results with, the ODFW hosts the Oregon Entanglement Advisory Committee, which does include many commercial fishermen on that committee, where I frequently, I'm on the committee, but I also present the results and get feedback and direction from them. Part of the project, which I didn't discuss today, is actually looking at scars on whales from entanglements. And we've actually partnered with a number of fishermen to give them cameras and a stipend. So whenever they're on the water and they happen to see whales, they take photos of the whales. And that data set has been immensely important and powerful to help us understand scarring rates on the whales. So yeah, through direct involvement with different fishermen, through the Crab Commission, through ODFW. Yes, we main focus is to try to keep them informed of what we're doing, have their feedback on what we're finding and what they're seeing on the water. So yeah.
Got it. Great. Kind of along those lines of fishing and entanglement, someone had asked in the chat if there have been documented entanglement of whales from crab fishing. Someone responded to that with a NOAA resource, but I was wondering if there was anything that you guys wanted to comment on that topic.
Yeah, definitely entanglements and fishing gear have been on the rise in the last 10 years along the whole West Coast, but including Oregon. There have been a number of documented cases basically each year. You know, the numbers aren't huge that are documented and confirmed entanglements. They're usually on the order of 1, 2, 3, and 4 in Oregon. But we are pretty confident that we're not observing all the entanglements. You know, either animals get entangled and they die and we never see them, or they shake the gear and so they're left with the scars. That's why looking at the scars has been able to give us an indication of what maybe a more realistic entanglement rate of these animals is. So yeah, it's definitely a concern. ODFW and all the state agencies and NOAA, it's a priority issue, which is why this take reduction team is happening in November to try and address this issue and reduce the number of entanglements. So everybody's really working hard to try and reduce the number of entanglements that happen.
Yeah. And then with that question, they had asked about possible entanglement in larger cables as a part of offshore wind infrastructure. I know that a lot of people have questions about the effects of offshore wind on marine mammals. And again, you know, now we've seen that this research is more about collecting baseline data and less about assessing the effects. But someone had responded, wind energy cables for the anchors and the moorings that would be used on floating offshore wind on the West Coast would be too big for a whale to directly get entangled on that infrastructure. But a concern, if offshore wind is developed, would definitely be secondary entanglement or tertiary entanglement on that infrastructure. So if a whale were already entangled in some sort of gear or rope, they could be at risk of getting entangled on offshore wind infrastructure. I don't know if you guys have thought about how this data that you're collecting now and in the past could maybe inform future management decisions or mitigation for if offshore wind is developed on the West Coast. Is that something that you guys have thought about, or is that a little bit too far ahead from this project?
Yeah, you mean in terms of this like secondary and tertiary entanglement issue?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think it's a concern, and I mean, so we know even now, like derelict fishing gear that's not recovered from the ocean is a problem for entanglement and of animals. Animals just get entangled in gear that was left out there. So ODFW does have a derelict gear recovery program, but obviously probably doesn't get it all. And yeah, if that gear gets wrapped up in, the cables and the whole wind energy array, that could also cause, increased entanglements. Or if a whale that is entangled goes through an array and gets, hooked into something. So, I mean, I think what should probably be seriously considered is having, a monitoring team out there in the renewable energy array that's constantly trying to identify debris that's getting caught in the system and then remove it to try to reduce that. Because I don't think we have any great ideas about how derelict gear moves through our oceans to be able to predict when and where that's going to happen.
Interesting. Thank you. Then one more question from before, which may be something you guys could answer, or maybe more about the effects. Someone said that they've heard that concern from fishermen that if wind arrays push marine mammals inshore, if the marine mammals or seabirds are avoiding the offshore wind arrays, that there could be an increased risk of interaction with fishing vessels that are more, concentrated in that inshore area. Do you guys have any thoughts on that risk?
Yeah, I think that is a serious thing to think about because, like I said at the beginning, of the presentation, there are many users out in the ocean, and they frequently don't, they have conflicts with each other. And so, yeah, if wind energy goes into a certain area and fisheries are pushed out of whatever area that is, that those fisheries could get pushed into habitat where there's more whales of one species or another. So, one thing we've learned with our work is that, gray whales, they tend to forage in our summers very close to shore. And then we have blue whales and then humpback whales further offshore. And so depending on where your fishery is within that, like if there are restrictions, okay, you can only fish within 50 fathoms, you're going to be putting a lot more pressure on, say, gray whales or blue whales. You might avoid humpback whales, but so same things with you've closed a certain section of the ocean and you push that fishing effort someplace else. They're always collateral effects, I would say, about where you're putting that fishing effort. So yeah, I think that's where some of that hot spot and cold spot work, can help inform that so that we don't offset, maybe impacts in one area, but put it too much in another area. But there's, like Don presented, there's so many different ways you can measure marine wildlife, presence, whether it's just presence or diversity or threatened status. So yeah, there's a lot of careful, I think, conversations that need to go into what we as a society want to protect and want to allow in our oceans.
Yeah, thank you. And there were a couple questions along the same line that I'll address, and then we'll get back to some from before. Someone asked similar question about offshore wind potentially driving species away because of acoustics or vibrations. And then someone in the Q&A asked something similar, that do energy structures create frequencies or noise that would disrupt animals that use sonar or echolocation or just rely on sound for behavioral things. So I think that you kind of answered that question, that would be a valid concern. Definitely the noise from development of anything offshore could push animals away. Did you guys have anything else to add? I think you kind of answered that well.
I'll just add that like in addition to pushing animals out of a habitat, which is one animal's potential response, the other is that animals can just stay in an area and tolerate a disturbance such as noise. And so we do see that in other areas. And that tolerating the noise, though, can have like physiological impacts. So one thing we've seen with gray whales here is that we study is that their stress levels, so their cortisol levels actually go up with increased noise and vessel traffic in this area. So even though they're staying here and maybe continuing to search and feed here, they are having an impact, that, physiological impact from that disturbance. And so, I mean, a similar thing is quite possible with, offshore wind energy development. We don't know yet because we haven't been able to study it yet. I don't know if you can.
Yeah. I was gonna point out the sort of staying in one place and exposure to something like noise. So, but the other thing I was just gonna add is that when thinking about something like wind energy development, there are a lot of different. So sound is super important to marine mammals and to cetaceans in the marine environment. Light attenuates really quickly, and so they rely on sound for a lot of different. It's like sort of one of their main sensory modalities that's really important. So that's why there is concern about noise, or interest in noise generally and sound when it comes to thinking about these animals. And when you think about developing anything in offshore waters, there's not just the what is, like, if there is a floating turbine and cable attached floating turbine, what is the noise from that going to be? There's also the construction and the vessel traffic associated with building and maintaining. And so I think I would just add sort of another layer or another nuance, that there are multiple sources of noise. They occur at different frequencies, and in different marine environments, the noise transmits differently. And so that's where it's really useful to look to other systems that have done, so like in the North Sea, there's been a lot of research on noise impacts on, for example, harbor porpoise around pile driving and turbine construction. That's an entirely different system than here in terms of the depth and the seafloor characteristics and the water column structure, and in terms of what the actual building of the turbines is like. And so, yeah, just to, I guess as ecologists, our favorite answer is it depends. And I'm giving you it depends answer. But just to say that in an environment like this, it's important to consider that yes, sound and noise are really important. And it's influenced by a lot of different things, different sources of noise and different ways in which it transmits. So that also emphasizes that if there is a future scenario where these turbines will be constructed in Oregon and California waters, we'll need to have appropriate monitoring to be able to understand what the impacts here will be, and sort of, modeling beforehand and monitoring during and after.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So a question from before was that even though these are somewhat long-term data sets, climate change predictions, things change, they need to be considered. So instead of where the animals would, sorry, let me try to reread this. So instead of, where the animals would be found, what are you guys doing to consider how these outside factors, like, you talked about laying the different factors, the different maps over each other. How can you predict climate change and influence on how accurate these models will be? I think that is what that question is getting at. But if anyone wants to clarify in the chat a follow-up question, yeah.
Well, I think it's a superb question, really, and it's something we are tackling daily. Like, how good can we get our models, considering things are changing so rapidly with environmental change? And certainly collecting more data under different environmental conditions is key, so that we can understand how animals are responding to those different environmental conditions. What Dawn tried to explain there with the functional response curves. So that basically means, like, with high temperature, animals might be more present than with low temperature, so that's sort of a response to that temperature gradient. But if you can imagine, if temperature, is going to extend to these higher temperature areas where we haven't even sampled, those are what we call novel conditions. It's going to be hard until we sample that and understand animal responses to actually predict. So it is something we are are certainly aware about, and we try to deal with it with what we call uncertainty. So that's basically, you know, if we haven't really sampled in those conditions a lot, you know, we have wider uncertainty about how animals might be distributed relative to that. And we try to account for that and propagate that further forward as we make these distributions. But yeah, we're constantly trying to collect more data, different environmental conditions, being aware of animals moving, you know, in response to that, and their prey. The more we understand how their prey responds to environment, then we can better understand how the predator might as well. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I agree that those functional relationships in our analyses are really sort of a window into, so you can do these surveys or make these recordings and say this is where animals are, and that's really useful right now. But the functional relationships to these conditions is what helps give you a little window into why, into what they're responding to. And so when you look to what the future is predicted to be, those relationships between an animal and something like temperature is what's going to give you some insight into what they might do with some associated uncertainty. The other thing that I would add is that climate change is ongoing. There are some sort of naturally occurring large scale patterns like El Nino events or things like that. And then now we're getting more frequent and more intense marine heat wave events. And those can be, so that it's always good to monitor across a broad range of conditions, but like Leigh was getting at is that these certain events can be really useful windows into what a longer term future might look like. And so with what Leigh was showing about how entanglement risk changed during a marine heat wave event, so we can take sort of what we know, what we know from what we're learning from the times that we have monitored, and look to these events that we don't plan but often occur. If you look at the ocean for long enough, you get these sort of snapshots of extreme events or of poor conditions or of maybe great conditions or what have you. And so even though we might not be doing this monitoring on like 50-year timescales right now, having the monitoring across a broad enough range of conditions to where you can learn from these snapshot extreme events and look to those functional relationships is what can give us sort of our best insight we can get into future impacts of ongoing climate change. And this is something, yeah, we put a lot of energy into thinking about, because how can you understand the impact of one particular human impact if you don't take it in the context of the oceans and everything that lives in it is changing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it sounds like just continuously collecting data into the future too is a good way to keep track of all of these changes.
Always more data.
Yeah. So
yeah, I mean, I don't think I mentioned this in my talk, but those helicopter surveys, putting observers on the different ships of opportunities, you know, that's something we're still doing in my lab, and we'll try to do through partnerships as long as possible, because yeah, the more data we get through different conditions, yeah, the better our models are, and the more conditions we monitor. So
yeah. So the first question that came in was wondering if funding for these types of programs and this type of research is that at risk because of changing federal priorities, or is there still an interest in, you know, continuing this sort of research? Because we know, I think that was coming from the fact that the MOSAIC project and some of these other projects, they do get federal funding.
yeah, the majority for all of the projects that I described are federal sources of funding. So, yep, so the Department of Energy funded the MOSAIC work, or is funding it, but you know, with the changing landscape about offshore renewables, that's unlikely to move forward. I mean, other people on this call might know better, but that's my thought anyway, is that until wind energy is more of a priority, that probably that funding source won't persist. Likewise, we got some funding from NASA to do the HALO work, which is amazing and awesome, but I have heard that Earth Sciences program at NASA won't probably persist. It is getting,
Hmm.
I mean, our funding will, but they're not funding new earth sciences program or projects. And then NOAA, so the funding, NOAA's funding for the OPAL work it has ended, but through partnerships with ODFW and the Oregon Dungeness Crab Commission, which are non-federal sources, are keeping that going for the next couple of years. I'm grateful for that. That's amazing. So yeah, certainly the changing priorities at a federal level for projects and funding are impacting and will impact in the future the ability to keep these projects going or surveys going. But it's always changing, so probably what I just said might change in a week, but we keep monitoring it, and we'll respond and work with our partners, I think is probably the best way.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will just, I guess, emphasize that they've been mostly federal, but there have been a lot of different funding sources that have supported this work, each of which generally for like a few years at a time. But we've been doing collecting the data. The data collection spans longer than the funded time frame for each particular project or funding source. And so I think it's a challenging time to think about the funding landscape and the future of data collection. But it is encouraging that even with sort of shorter windows of funding that target a specific management priority, keeping the consistency of the data collection methods lets us leverage data collection that's far beyond the lifespan of a particular grant cycle. And so I guess offer that as a tiny, maybe optimistic kernel that hopefully, like, by taking advantage of the bits of funding that are hopefully available, or, fingers crossed that we can continue the work so that it can be applied to multiple different applications or outcomes or sort of angles on what the data can be used for.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so that I kind of had that question with, now that Oregon does not have offshore wind energy areas, how do you see the data from the MOSAIC piece of the puzzle fitting into other uses for Oregon? I know that Northern California still has their lease areas off of Humboldt, so that's still very relevant. But have you guys thought of maybe other ways that data could fit into other topics, kind of like what you were saying?
Yeah, well, it certainly has. So what I presented about the OPAL project, that's actually OPAL 1. We actually have OPAL 2, which is the work that we're doing now, which is essentially the same thing, but and sometimes we refer to it as MOSOPAL because we've actually combined the data collected in MOSAIC and the OPAL project to develop better species distribution models to inform that fisheries entanglement risk assessment. And likewise, the MOSAIC project uses the data from OPAL and the HALO project. So, that data still remains in our labs. And as we go forward and, another issue emerges in our water, whether it's fisheries or vessel traffic or another use of our oceans, that those data layers are certainly usable for multiple issues to assess and look at spatial patterns.
Yeah, great. So we've got 10 minutes left and a couple more questions I have to get to. So if anyone has an extra question, I would encourage you getting that in now. Someone asked about the Cascadia Research Collective. And I think the question was kind of implying, what type of partnerships you guys have, what type of other research there is in this region. Someone else also asked in the chat, how could we maybe facilitate conversations with Northern California as they possibly move to develop their Northern California lease areas? What can we learn from California? What type of regional partnerships are there that address this topic? Wondering if you guys have any thoughts on that.
Well, partnerships are awesome. I mean, one thing probably is important to emphasize is that collecting the data that we've explained, whether it's visual surveys or the hydrophones or the tracking data or the photo ID data, that takes a lot of time and a lot of manpower and a lot of money. So the more we can work with partners, so like Cascadia or other research groups around to cover certain areas of the ocean or to use their particular expertise. So Cascadia, their partnership in the MOSAIC project has been through tagging work. And so if that's, an area of their expertise, or other people. So, the Marine Mammal Institute's great and we're large and we have a lot of expertise, but we're certainly not everywhere all the time and doing everything perfectly. And I think that's the beauty of partnerships and collaborations is through that, we can learn more and get more coverage of knowledge gaps. So
Yeah.
so that's it from the sort of science data collection side. I think the other side of your question was about working with our Northern California partners or something.
Yeah, so I think this question was a little bit more about offshore wind energy, and as California tries to move forward with their lease areas, I guess what are your thoughts? What are your suggestions on how Oregon could learn from what's going on in California, or how these types of projects, this type of data could inform us?
Do you want to tackle that?
It's okay.
Well, I guess, I mean, I don't know. I mean, certainly watching and learning. I think, a huge component to it is community engagement, right? And seeing how, just like you brought up earlier about how fisheries respond to, progress, and how maybe that's mitigated or handled and what the impacts are, how our outputs from this work are interpreted by managers. I think will be a big thing for us to watch, like what they see as data gaps or how much uncertainty they're willing to handle, or what they're like those conservation hotspots, which one are they actually gonna pay most attention to? So certainly we're interested to see how it's applied down there, and that will inform, how we move forward with things into the future. So,
Yeah, I guess the other thing, I mean, the only other thing that I would add is that, earlier we were talking about how our work is really on the sort of the front end of before offshore renewable energy development, if it's going to happen, before it happens, sort of that they can consider our information, our data outputs. But in terms of thinking about, impacts, there's a lot of, we can learn from other systems, but there are a lot of things that are, unique about the Northern California current compared to other regions where wind energy infrastructure has been developed. The floating technology, the upwelling dynamics, the species composition, etc. And Northern California is part of this Northern California current ecosystem. There are, regional differences, but there are a lot of sort of key ecosystem similarities and technological hurdles or like infrastructure hurdles to overcome in each of these places. And so in terms of things like what would the noise impacts be, what would the like vessel traffic needs for be, I think that if it goes ahead outside of Oregon and then Oregon can learn from that, it could provide a lot of information, sort of fill some of those unknowns about the like technology, infrastructure, interactions with the ecosystem here specifically.
Yep. And then there were just a few more questions. I know we're almost at time, so I'm going to put up the post-webinar survey for participants to take while we just get through these last few questions. So I'll launch that. And then there were a couple questions kind of about the methods, which I think could be quickly answered. Were there any attempts at acoustic monitoring of seabirds? Can you acoustically listen for seabirds, or is that more of a method for marine mammals?
The acoustic monitoring that we are doing is with hydrophones. So those are microphones that are completely submerged, that are anchored to the seafloor and then sit up in the water column. And sound transmits really efficiently through water, so that means that you get a pretty good sized listening range for a whole lot of marine mammals that are very vocal around a submerged hydrophone. And so that is not, so you can use acoustic monitoring in the air and in terrestrial systems. And for birds, that's maybe more often done like at colonies and things like that. And so for sort of the area that we want to cover in this project, the visual surveys are the most effective way to monitor the most number of birds over the most number of species over the largest area, for the seabirds compared to the submerged hydrophones for the marine mammals.
Got it, got it. And then someone was wondering what your perspective is on what the impact of a relatively small area of one of those large hotspots, like for example, the Brookings wind energy area, which, now is no longer, but as an example, do you think that having wind energy areas or other activity in those large hotspots is a big impact? Or does it depend, it depends on
yeah, I think it
hotspot,
really depends
yeah.
what the human activity is there. I mean, what our results show is that that's where those species of conservation concern are. And
Yeah.
so driving a boat through there, maybe won't have an impact, but putting up maybe a huge density of wind farms, right there, or if, I don't know, it depends what it is, even maybe, yeah. So it's hard to know what the exact impact will be without knowing what the human activity will be. Even a wind farm, if it's like at the different height, or, doesn't operate in the fall because those animals are there in the spring or something like that. So yeah, it depends as much on the animal activity as it does on the human activity in the area.
Yeah, okay. The last question real quick was if you could talk a little bit more about the survey types that you use to gather winter and spring data.
So our winter data primarily comes from those helicopter surveys. So people that live on the Oregon coast, we know how difficult the sea conditions can be in the winter, but flying above it can be really helpful in those periods. So that's a powerful, unique part, and that in partnership with the hydrophone, the acoustic data. So that's the majority of our winter data that's incorporated into the models.
Got it.
Yeah,
Got
and a handful of cruises during short weather windows in the winter, but the cruise data is really mostly in the summer,
mostly
and
spring, summer, fall.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that was all of the questions we had, and we're right at time. I'm wondering, just to wrap it up, if you guys could share what you think the, best takeaways from this research are, or your favorite takeaway, or how you're, what you're looking to in the future.
Yeah, I guess just the importance of continuing this baseline, data collection. Like I started, putting students and people on these ships of opportunities a while ago, before, any of these issues were really on the forefront of our Oregonians' minds, and it's turned out to be incredibly important and powerful. So, start collecting the data of interest early, use standardized methods. I hope to continue to keep that going forward, and putting our work, in the hands of people that make important decisions, working with partnerships and having open conversations about everybody's different opinions and perspectives and priorities. Because I think that's part of where we are now with at least the MOSAIC project is what is the priority for conservation and protection. And that's not a scientist question to answer, that's a societal question. So I'm really interested to have those conversations with a range of different ocean users to hear what their thoughts are.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I would echo all of that and just say that the value of this continued data collection can't be understated, because it's what allows management decisions to be based on data-driven, analysis and interpretation of the environment and the place of interest. And so, yeah, having the ability to make decisions based on regional and robust data is really key. And and the other piece, like Leigh said, is that those data-driven outputs are really important. And then there's still a sort of priority and values-driven step that needs to happen, and that comes from the managers and the stakeholders. And so that's where continuing these conversations beyond what we do at, on a ship or at our computers, that's the next step, is continuing these conversations into groups like this so that the information can be interpreted and tailored and applied to issues of interest and of concern to communities.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys. Those are great closing answers. And thank you again for answering our questions and sharing an overview of this research. I'm excited to see where it goes, and I will follow up with all the registrants with a recording and some additional resources. Thank you all for your participation and for joining us this morning. All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Sara. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Guys. Bye, everyone. Have a good day.